All right, let's take you live now to this colloquium held at Rhodes University, where the designate defense minister is speaking for the first time. I don't know if she's on the podium yet, but let's take you there live.
The right people intact. We must also remember that we cannot honor South Africans without reflecting and honoring those who sometimes unknowingly were arrested, were tortured, disappeared for doing nothing but being related or for knowing those who were active in the struggle. We must also not forget those who gave their lives, who were banished, murdered, and even those who were put up as enemy agents to be killed by their own people. We must also remember that in every armed struggle, the women have not always just been onlookers. They have been active, sometimes on both sides of the issue. I want to here remember two particular women, ex-prisoners and members of Umkhonto weSizwe, least known and least spoken about. We buried Elizabeth Nhlapo, who was actively carrying out missions within South Africa, semi-literate, ex-political prisoner, a recruiter and transporter of guerrillas. We must remember Bona Makwere, a young woman from Mamelodi, the organizer of the biggest civil demonstration and marches in Mamelodi, died unbeknown, buried, Papa's funeral. But we remember the spirits of these two very different women, because if we do not do so, the role of these women will remain unacknowledged. If we, those of us who have lived, trained, laughed, cried with them, cannot stand up today and say, but there were others too. There were others who could not speak for themselves. That must be remembered. There were others who spoke different languages and came from different parts of South Africa. Because from the arrival of the ships throughout the wars of dispossession and the establishment of the apartheid system, women were active. The treatment of indigenous people were horrendous. But history tells us that one of the first women of this country was Krotoa. Humiliated, was she praised? No. By both sides? No. Used? Yes. Incarcerated? Yes. Loss of children? Yes. Has that not been happening throughout the 70s, the 80s, the 90s to us? Yes, a repeat of history. So throughout the history of South Africa, we see the role of the woman prominent and yet immediately diminished. We see the contribution of women in culture, in the maintenance of the families, being reduced to those of being associates. And therefore, when we look at disenfranchisement, you can look at the role, not the role, the position of South African women as nothing else but sometimes elevated servants, even slaves within households and communities. When you look at other marital statuses of women, you wonder whether we will really ever get to where we can say all the people are equal. And therefore, when you look at what the African woman has endured in this country, you look at the pain of the wars of dispossession. You look at the role played by the warrior queens, which actually encouraged the class of 76, the us, to insist on going to fight. Because if they could stand up for their people, if they could lead wars, then we thought in 1976 we could do the same. When you looked at the land dispossession, when you looked at the indigenous male and his emasculation, when you look at the deliberate dilution of the African cultures, and therefore the focused attention that the regimes did to really do away with the African family unit. You look at women then trying to assume the leadership of this family unit, sometimes succeeding, sometimes the results were not so good. Now, when you look at the Land Act, the Group Areas Act, 1950, the Immorality Act, the Black Education Act, you go back to the 1923 Native Urban Act, which regulated the presence of Africans in the urban space, and you see that these later acts were just augmenting what was begun in the 20s, the complete annihilation of the African life and African aspirations. So we cannot but say we thank the women who came before us. We thank their courage to stand. We thank Charlotte Maxeke for not only beginning the walk towards freedom by establishing the Bantu Women's League, but for also being our eyes in that inaugural conference in Mangaung. We thank Maxeke for being at the forefront of educating women and leading from the front. Because that courage, you see, multiplied even by the women of the Northwest when they began to mobilize against the Dompasses. You see this action spreading across, and you see women in the 60s, the 70s, beginning to look at different ways of organizing women. You look at the work of Masisulu, the establishment of sewing networks, the establishment of childcare facilities throughout Soweto and the country, which were created to continue the dialogue amongst women, the conscientization of women, which were also used as a network to ensure that messages, arms, people, warm bodies are passed from house to house, hidden, cared for. So we must thank our mothers for this. We thank the women who, led by Bodorothi Nyembe, actually analyzed the situations and physically went on rampage to destroy the beer halls, because the concoctions which our fathers were given, the assembly points around the beer halls actually contributed to the dissolution of families. Started this trend of domestic violence because our men were feeling weakened and taking it out of the women. So when Sankara says, we do not talk of women's emancipation as an act of charity or as an act of the search of human compassion, we understand where he comes from. But we in the ANC actually spoke about the active participation of women being at the forefront of pushing themselves and pushing for their nation. I spoke about Croteau, I spoke about Maxeke and the formation of the women's case. and the sometimes physical confrontation with the authorities. I speak about Ellen Kuzwayo as the first amongst the executive of the Youth League at its formation. I speak about Ngoi, who becomes the first woman in the executive of the ANC. I speak about Masisulu at the heart of the Defiance campaign. I speak about the role Winnie played in motivating and ensuring that the spirit of fighting does not die out within the country. We honor women who challenged, protested, and mobilized against passes. We cannot forget Bomam Helen Joseph, Sophie de Grey. We cannot forget Rahima Musa. We cannot forget my favorite Menyembe. Program Director, I have tried to say that women have used every weapon they could muster against oppression. I have said that they have formed little organizations to come together. I have said that the Black Sash needs to be remembered, not only as those women who stood in the streets, but as women who also mobilized assistance and sustenance for families of those who were incarcerated. FETSO came together to speak about us securing what they called full equality. We cannot talk about women in the liberation movement without talking about the agitators who were out there. And therefore, you turn your spotlight on the women like Nadim Godima, Bome Miriam Tladi, who used their pens to write and to encourage. We cannot celebrate the struggle against oppression without looking at Bo Memakeba, Bo Membulu, without looking at the younger generation, Yabo Brenda Fassi. So why did we go into the armed struggle? If you ask me today, I would say to you, the group of 76 went there because we were getting tired of the boot. It wasn't just the language of the oppressor being pushed down our throat. It was also the kind of future, the education that was fed to us, made us. But what did we do? Did we join freely? Yes, we joined freely, some of us. But we also know that there were those who went into exile following. We also know that it was an issue to convince the men once we were in MK that we were equal. I remember that in the first 2 weeks we got into Dar es Salaam, staying in those residences in Temeke, that a number of us, always fewer in number, overwhelmed by the young men who we stayed with, had to fight. Because there was an automatic belief by some of the young men that for as long as women were there, we would be able to service their needs. It is also worth noting that even at that time, fresh from the streets of South Africa, very little politicization that had come in, very little knowledge about gender equality and so on. There were young men who sprang up to protect us. It is important also to note that when we got into exile, we got into countries we did not know. I remember that the only thing that I was wearing was a miniskirt, and minis were outlawed in Tanzania. And therefore, the first hurdle was find clothes that were not illegal in Tanzania to wear. But there were other difficulties. We're all South African young people. We came from different corners. Some of those who went into exile had never even seen the cities before. Some of those who went into exile only spoke their languages, their home towns or provinces. Some of us were angry little kids who had to learn to adapt. Did we fit in the military camps? Yes, we tried. Did we always come together as women? Yes, we did. Did we stand up for other women? No, we couldn't. Because as soon as we were drafted and with our own fight to get into the military camps, we became soldiers. We are under the control of section commissars and commanders. We did and carried out what we must do. Did we always manage to bring each other's up as women? Yes. And here I want to take out Comrade Mavis, Dr. Thandi Modise. Because while some of us became political commissars, Comrade Mavis concentrated in making sure that women had lessons after the lessons of MK and all the marching and drills to ensure that their educational needs were upgraded, that they had functional skills, that they could then be promoted or be sent elsewhere for further trainings. And therefore the work that Mavis did in Novo Katenga, for instance, was very important. I heard here that Comrade Jemima is on this webinar. The work done by Comrade Jemima, running up and down the continent, delivering material, was risky and dangerous. And yet, easier for women to pull through because in its masculine thinking, Africa did not expect women to be the ones who would be transporting bombs and weapons across. And therefore, the risks taken helped those who were deployed to carry out their missions. So when you look at the women in the armed struggle, you must also look at those who physically went in the camps, but those who carried out work that needed to be carried out to enable the struggle to move forward. You must look at those who were deployed across the world to find food, clothes, writing materials, things that would enable us to become soldiers and to concentrate on being soldiers and to come back and to fight. And oftentimes they are not mentioned because it is not taken as work that is worth mentioning. We had to firstly fight about language used in MK. Our first hurdle might seem like a joke today, but when we came into MK, the men in MK did not know how to call us. Were we comrades equal to the men? Were we women comrades? And the first rejection we had to do was to be referred to as she comrades. And finally, we convinced the men that we were men and women of equal valor, of equal sacrifice, and therefore that the word, simple as it was, did very fine for both men and women. And we settled, after a long argument, to be addressed as Comrade Thandi and not as she, Comrade Thandi. Did we find a problem when we learned how to shoot? Yes, we did. Did we experience hurdles in running up and down the mountains in those iron-capped boots? Yes, it was difficult. Did we give in? No, we did not give in. In fact, if you look at comrades like Nonzwagazi or Comrade Mamungi, they were the best in the field. They outshot most of the men I started training with. Did they become commanders? I don't know what happened in the period I spent in jail, but I suspect they were not. The second hurdle was to refuse to be treated, especially after the first rounds of battles were fought. We fought to do equal duty post at the sentries. We fought to be addressed as equals, as I said. We fought to be respected as commanders and not just commanders of women. We did very well in the academics. We fought the daily proposals of marriage. We resorted to asking to be put on preventative, what do you call it, this family planning stuff, simply because we were not always sure that we would not find ourselves pregnant and therefore playing into the hands of our male counterparts and being told to go to Morogoro. We then took the experience we had from Konto Wesizwe when we finally came out to that very important conference, Comrade Tenjiwe will remember, when we, perhaps because the scars were still deep, fought for and got a position from the women to agitate, advocate for the police service, which was not a force, for a defense force which was representative of all the sections of South Africa. Those positions we took at that conference, the Malibongwe conference, long before we formed the Women's Coalition later, long before we were to get into parliament and to self-select into the committees that we thought were strategic. We had to get into the defense committees of parliament, the intelligence committees, the police committees, because it was important for us to ensure that that space was opened up for women. In parliament, I remember a fight I had with a woman who was called general, who knew nothing about weapons. And the argument in that committee was, should women be allowed in the army? And we said yes. In MK, the training we had was equivalent to infantry training. Yes, we wanted to see women in the Air Force. And no, we were not going to be confined like the SADF women had been confined to desk work, to communications, and to the medical services. Yes, we fought for the opening of all musterings for the women. And therefore, one can only look at what we later on did. If South Africa was going to have an accepted national defense force, then we pushed for a defense review, participation by South Africans in all corners of South Africa. I am quite convinced that in the rural areas, when communities came together and put their views, that those views were dominated by women because the men were working in the towns and the cities. Yes, we fought. Yes, we visited the military camps, not only to look at where the women were finding themselves in, but to see to it that the policies that we were agitating for, that we were passing in Parliament, were actually being agitated, being added and being acted upon. When South Africa, after the first democratic elections, started moving into Africa, when our defense force had to deploy in the DRC, for instance, one can only look at the women then, mostly coming from the former non-statutory forces, who not only did their peacekeeping missions, doing what was scripted, but who went out of their way to deal with issues of child soldiers, created voluntarily unmandated programs to reorientate those young children, started literacy classes for those children to begin to prepare us for a more equal society, even in the foreign countries. Did we sit back and say South Africa is fine now that we, the former female guerrillas, were in Parliament? No, we did not. In the drafting of the defense-related acts, it was the women in the committee, for instance, who came up and said, but we cannot leave the deployment of our defense forces to the executive alone. We reckoned that Parliament basically increased the voice of women on behalf of other women stronger than the women who found themselves in the executive. And therefore, you find that inclusion in the Defense Act that says deployments will be ratified by Parliament within 14 days. Otherwise, Parliament had the power to say that mission is not continuing. When you looked at the Arms Control Act, it was again at the instance of women that we began to push for where the weapons manufactured and sold by South Africa landed. And therefore, you look at the guideline that is put there. Did this buy us favors, those who were agitating for this? No, because in everywhere, gender equality is not served on a platter. There are people who must agitate, there are people who must fight for it. And therefore, I must say that the reasons why we joined, the reasons why we still want to be around the issues of women is simply because we do not want to see a repeat. Some years ago, through the ANC Women's League, we convened a conference of former women combatants in SADC, but we also looked and reflected on where the women fighters, commanders, and generals of Liberia and I think Sierra Leone found themselves. We were there when the deals were being brokered for the women of the DRC. Some of us actually went with some of them as far as the World Bank to try and look at a better reorientation package for these other women, because we realized that as South Africa, we had not done well about the reorientation and resettlement of women in particular. We were there when Burundi was discussing. We were there when Rwanda was discussing, because we had to make sure that the women came out better scarred than we were. Comparatively speaking, the ANC did well. But we can never be complacent, because even though some of us were able to run away from threats of rape very early on, There may have been amongst us women who were not as lucky. What we did very well as MK women also was, after the completion of our basic training, to refuse, some of us, the typewriters. To refuse. You couldn't have been a commissar, been the first to make a homemade bomb in your platoon, being a good sniper amongst the men, and being told to now go and set at a residence somewhere and become a typist. So I want to say that the role of South African women in the armed struggle can never be diminished. We are fighting to ensure that it is captured, it is remembered. We are fighting to remember the women political prisoners. We are fighting to remember those who shouldn't even have been in the armed forces, in particular the nuns in Johannesburg who held harboring guerrillas, who hid weapons under the leadership of Sister Bernard. I remember a particular nun who, because she was recruiting in the Eastern Cape, ended up being married to Bokholani and serving time with us in prison. So the role of women in the armed struggle was diverse. It was not the same. And we can only say that we hope that these little contributions of women make them better leaders. Because if you have led a section, a platoon, or a company, you can lead a nation actually. Because the exercise of power, the ability of a commander to have sometimes the lives of the people they lead in their hands, creates a consciousness that cannot die within 10 years. And that is why today we will call on these stalwarts of our people to stand up again for what we agreed upon. An equal society where men and all gender specific individual is comfortable, where we can plow back and create peace, not only in our country, but where we can go and multiply this peace. I want to end here and thank you for inviting us. Because as I say, the story of the South African woman is still to be told. Thank you very much, Program Director.
Thank you so much, Modise. Rialebuha. Thank you so much. We thank you to your generation, to women like you, and to the women who came before you, who have paved a way for us.
Well, Thandi Modise, they're speaking at the Rhodes University virtual colloquium, and her topic there being the role of South African women in the armed struggle. And some of the women she had to mention were Ellen Kuzwayo, Elizabeth Nhlapo, who says was an ex-political prisoner, Konama Khweri, who she said were women who were not celebrated enough, and saying there were others too, and she couldn't go exhaust the list, and wondering if we'll ever get to a place where we say all the women are equal, and talking also about the role of Charlotte Manyama-Xeke in the inaugural conference of the African National Congress in Mangaung, where men were more highlighted than women. And she talking about her time in Tanzania, saying that they had to convince men in the MK that they were all equal, and that some men in the MK, and this has been documented in many books, had automatic belief that the women who were there, who were outnumbered, would be there to satisfy the needs of women, and saying in the end that what she really wants to ask government and men in society is to go back to what was agreed upon at the beginning to have an equal society. Let's take a break.